dragged into the darkness. It started with a simple, recurring nightmare, something that seemed almost laughable in the beginning. I'd find myself lying in bed, unable to move, with the room around me bathed in an eerie, blood-red glow. I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the floorboards, like nails dragging slowly, deliberately. My heart would pound as I tried to lift my head, but no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't move. Then, from the shadows in the corner of the room, it would emerge, a figure shrouded in darkness, its form twisted and unnatural. The thing was humanoid in shape, but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long, its posture hunched, and its eyes were the worst. They glowed with a sickly yellow light, unblinking and filled with a malevolence that sent chills down my spine. Each night, the dream would progress. The figure would stand closer to my bed, the scraping sound growing louder, more frantic. And each time I could do nothing but watch as it inched nearer, its hands slowly reaching out toward me. I'd always wake up just as its cold fingers were about to touch my skin, my heart racing, my sheets soaked with sweat. But then the dream began to seep into my waking life. It started with small things. I'd find the bed covers crumpled at the foot of the bed when I woke up, even though I was sure I had straightened them before going to sleep. My curtains, which I always left closed, would be slightly parted, as if someone had been peeking through them. And then there were the noises. The same scraping sound from the dream, faint at first, but growing louder every night. One night, I woke up to a sensation of something cold and heavy on my chest. It was the same feeling of paralysis from the dream, but this time I was fully awake. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it. The figure from my nightmares, standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it started to move toward me. My heart hammered in my chest as I fought to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers wrapping around my ankle. The touch was ice cold, sending a shock through my entire body. With a sudden jerk, it began to pull me off the bed. My body slid helplessly across the sheets, the mattress creaking under the weight of the unseen force dragging me down. As my legs dangled off the edge of the bed, the terror reached a fever pitch. My mind screamed at me to fight, to break free, but my limbs remained unresponsive, heavy as lead. The creature's grip tightened, and I could feel the pressure of its claws digging into my flesh, cold and unyielding. In a final, desperate attempt to resist, I summoned every ounce of strength I had. My body finally responded, and I kicked out with all my might. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the room, shaking the walls. Its grip loosened just enough for me to pull free, and I scrambled backward on the bed, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grasp it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the room was flooded with light, and the creature was gone. The room was empty, the only sound the rapid thudding of my own heartbeat. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, that it was over. But as I caught my breath and looked down at my ankle, my stomach twisted in horror. There, wrapped around my skin, were dark, bruised impressions. Finger marks, deep and unmistakable. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that house, from whatever had invaded my dreams and crossed into my reality. But as the days passed, I realized there was no escaping it. The bruises on my ankle never fully healed, always darkening as if fresh. And no matter where I went, I could still hear that scraping sound, following me, haunting me. Now every night is a battle to stay awake, to keep the darkness at bay. But I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again, dragging me down into the shadows. And this time, I might not be able to escape. Summoned evil. It started as a faint scratching noise, just loud enough to be noticed, but easy enough to dismiss. I had just moved into a quaint old house on the edge of town, a place that had stood empty for years. The rent was cheap, and the house had a charm that drew me in despite the slightly run-down appearance. It was just what I needed, or so I thought. The first night, I heard the scratching while I was unpacking in the living room. It came from above, maybe in the attic. I paused, listened for a moment, then shook my head and continued unpacking. Old houses make noises, I told myself. By the second night, the scratching had grown louder and more insistent. It now seemed to be coming from the walls, moving from one spot to another. I tried to ignore it, thinking it must be some animal trapped inside the walls. I made a mental note to call an exterminator the next day. But by the third night, the scratching had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the noise. It was the sense of something moving around me, something watching. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening as the sounds moved from the attic to the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it was something more. That night, I dreamed of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, bony fingers that reached toward me as I lay paralyzed with fear. I couldn't see its face, only the gleam of eyes in the darkness. When I woke, my heart was pounding, and I was drenched in sweat. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I climbed up into the attic, expecting to find some sign of the animal that had been making the noise. Instead, I found nothing but dust and cobwebs. The attic was empty. Yet the sense of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. That evening, as I sat in the living room, the scratching returned. This time, it wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, like something was brushing against the inside of the walls. I tried to distract myself with television, but the noise grew louder, more urgent. Then, for the first time, I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind outside. But it was there, a voice, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. I turned off the TV and strained to listen, but the voice faded away, leaving only the relentless scratching. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that shadowy figure standing over me, its presence more real than ever before. And always, there was the scratching, the whispering, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. The following day, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I decided to do some research on the house, hoping to find an explanation for what I was experiencing. I spent hours at the local library, digging through old records and newspapers. What I found only deepened my fear. The house had a dark history. It had belonged to a man named Samuel Ward, who had lived there alone for many years. Neighbors described him as a reclusive and eccentric man, obsessed with the occult. He was rumored to have dabbled in satanic rituals, trying to communicate with spirits, or perhaps something far worse. One day, he simply vanished, leaving the house to fall into disrepair. No one knew what had happened to him. Some said he had gone mad and disappeared into the woods. Others whispered that he had succeeded in summoning something and that it had taken him. The house had stood empty ever since, shunned by the locals who believed it was cursed. I returned home that evening, my mind racing. I didn't know if I believed the stories, but something was happening in that house, something I couldn't explain. As night fell, the scratching and whispering resumed, louder than ever before. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I could feel the presence closing in, pressing against the walls, the floors, the very air around me. Desperate, I called a friend who was knowledgeable about the paranormal. He agreed to come over the next day and help me figure out what was going on. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the whispering grew louder, almost a chant. I could feel the presence in the room with me, no longer content to stay hidden in the walls. At dawn, the noises stopped abruptly. The silence was almost more terrifying than the sounds. I waited for what felt like hours, but the presence didn't return. I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had been haunting the house had finally left. My friend arrived later that morning, armed with various tools and a solemn expression. He walked through the house, stopping in every room, feeling the air, listening. Finally, he turned to me and said, "There's something here, something old and angry. It's been trapped in this house for a long time." He explained that whatever Samuel Ward had summoned had never left. It had been waiting, feeding on the house's energy, growing stronger, and now it had noticed me. We decided to perform a cleansing ritual, hoping to drive the entity out. My friend warned me that it might not work, but I was willing to try anything. We began the ritual at dusk, chanting and burning sage, trying to banish the dark presence from the house. At first, nothing happened. Then, the scratching started again, louder and more frantic than ever before. The whispering grew into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, a language I couldn't understand. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on us from all sides. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and a low growl reverberated through the house. My friend's voice faltered, but he continued the ritual, his words growing more urgent. The growl turned into a roar, shaking the walls, rattling the windows. And then, everything stopped. The air grew still, the voices fell silent, and the temperature returned to normal. We waited, holding our breath, but the presence was gone. The house felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. My friend looked at me and nodded. "I think it's over." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. That night, as I lay in bed, exhausted but hopeful, I heard it again, the scratching, faint at first, then growing louder. The whispering returned, the voices now angry, full of malice. And then, the bed shook. I froze, fear rooting me to the spot. The bed shook again, harder this time, as if something was trying to pull me out of it. The shadows in the room deepened, and I felt the presence closing in, more powerful and furious than before. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and the bed shook violently. I felt something cold wrap around my ankle, pulling me toward the edge of the bed. I screamed, thrashing, trying to free myself, but the grip tightened. Suddenly, the door burst open, and my friend rushed in, chanting the words from the ritual. The presence recoiled, and the grip on my ankle loosened. The room seemed to pulse with dark energy. and for a moment, I thought the house might tear itself apart. But then, with a final bone-chilling roar, the presence retreated. The shadows receded, the voices fell silent, and the bed stopped shaking. My friend could finally relax, exhausted but triumphant. We didn't waste any time. I packed what little I had and left the house that night, never looking back. We later found out that the house burned down a few days after we left. No one knew how the fire started, but it didn't surprise me. It was as if the house itself had finally succumbed to the darkness within. To this day, I can still hear the faint scratching in my nightmares, and sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can feel that cold grip around my ankle, reminding me that some things can never be truly escaped. The thing in the attic. When my wife and I bought our first house, it felt like a dream come true. It was an old Victorian-style home, the kind with creaky wooden floors and a charming, if slightly worn feel to it. We were both thrilled to finally have a place of our own after years of renting cramped apartments. The house had character, as the realtor had put it, and we couldn't wait to make it our own. The first few weeks were blissful. We spent our evenings painting the walls, picking out furniture, and enjoying the novelty of having so much space. There was something so satisfying about turning a house into a home, and we relished every moment. But as the days passed, a sense of unease started to creep in. It was subtle at first. A misplaced item here, a strange noise there, but it grew with each passing day. It started with the attic. The house had a large, unfinished attic that we hadn't done much with. It was mostly used for storing boxes and old furniture left by the previous owners. Neither of us spent much time up there, as it was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but it was nice to have the extra storage space. One night, as we were settling into bed, we heard a soft thudding noise from above. It was faint, almost like something heavy being dropped on the floorboards. My wife and I looked at each other, both trying to brush it off as the house settling, or perhaps a raccoon. But the sound came again, a little louder this time. A soft, rhythmic thud, like someone was walking across the attic floor. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "It's probably just the wind or something." But we both knew it wasn't the wind. Over the next few nights, the noises continued. Sometimes it was the same soft thudding. Other times it was a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My wife suggested we call an exterminator, thinking it might be a raccoon or some other animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. The sounds were too deliberate, too human. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench for protection, I climbed the narrow stairs leading to the attic. My wife stayed downstairs, nervously clutching her phone, ready to call for help if needed. The attic was just as we had left it, dusty, cluttered, and cold. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Everything seemed normal at first. I checked every corner, peered behind boxes, and even tapped on the walls to see if there was any hidden entrance that an animal might have used. But there was nothing. Just an empty, silent attic. I was about to head back downstairs when something caught my eye. In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by a stack of old furniture, was a small wooden door. It was odd, I didn't remember seeing it before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the door cautiously. It was old and worn, the wood splintered and weathered. There was no handle, just a small keyhole, but the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly in the silence, making me wince. Beyond the door was a small, dark room, more of a crawl space than a room, really. The air inside was stale and cold, and a musty smell hit me as I peered inside. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. Tucked into the far corner of the crawl space was a small wooden box. It was plain and unremarkable, about the size of a shoebox, but something about it made my skin crawl. I approached it slowly, goosebumps all over my body. There was no lock, just a simple latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I opened the box, and what I found inside still haunts me to this day. The box was filled with old photographs, yellowed with age. It was a woman, young, beautiful, with dark hair and a warm smile. But as I flipped through the photos, I noticed something unsettling. In each picture, the woman looked more and more distressed. Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of fear and sadness. The last photo was different. The woman was still there, but her face was twisted in a look of sheer terror. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. And standing behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long bony fingers resting on the woman's shoulder. I dropped the photo in shock, my breath catching in my throat. I had to get out of there. I slammed the box shut and backed out of the crawl space, my hands shaking. I didn't stop to close the door or put anything back. I just ran down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. When I got back downstairs, my wife took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told her everything. About the box, the photos, the figure. We both agreed we couldn't stay in the house that night. We packed a bag and left, checking into a nearby hotel. The next day, I called a friend who was into paranormal investigations. I told him about what I had found, and he agreed to come over and take a look. When we returned to the house, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The house felt different, darker, more oppressive. My friend went up to the attic while we waited downstairs, too scared to go back up. He was gone for a long time. When he finally came back down, he looked pale and shaken. He didn't say much, just that we should leave and never come back. We didn't need to be told twice. We packed up our things and moved out within the week. We never did find out what happened in that house, who the woman in the photos was, or what that thing in the shadows had been. We heard rumors that the house had a dark history, that something terrible had happened there many years ago, but we didn't stick around to find out. We sold the house at a loss and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those sounds, the soft thudding, the scraping, and I wonder if whatever was in that house followed us. If it's still out there, waiting, watching for its next victim. The demon in the shadows. It started as nothing more than a recurring nightmare. Every night, as soon as I closed my eyes, I would find myself in a dark, endless void. There was nothing but silence at first, a deafening quiet that wrapped around me like a shroud. I would stand there, suspended in darkness, feeling utterly alone. But then, out of the shadows, it would emerge, A figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing like hot embers. The first few nights, the figure would just watch me, standing at a distance, its presence ominous but not threatening. I could never see its face clearly, just the vague outline of a man, or something like a man. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch and curl like smoke. But it was the eyes that terrified me the most. They glowed with an unnatural light, red and malevolent, boring into me as if it could see every dark thought I had ever had. As the nights went on, the figure grew bolder. It would start to move toward me, slowly at first, as if savoring my fear. I tried to run, but my feet would feel like they were sinking into the ground, as if the darkness itself was holding me in place. I would scream, but no sound would come out. The figure would get closer and closer until it was right in front of me, its breath hot and rancid on my face. It would reach out with one of its long, bony hands, and just as it was about to touch me, I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to brush it off as just a nightmare, a product of stress and an overactive imagination. But it kept happening, night after night, each time getting worse. The figure would get closer, its hand brushing against my skin, cold and slimy like the touch of a corpse. And then one night, it spoke. Its voice was low and guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together, and it said just one word: soon. I woke up screaming that night, my throat raw, tears streaming down my face. I was too scared to go back to sleep, so I sat up in bed, clutching the covers around me, my eyes darting around the room. But everything was quiet, the room still and empty. I told myself it was just a dream, just a stupid nightmare that couldn't hurt me. But the next night, the dream was different. This time, I didn't wake up when the figure touched me. It grabbed my arm, its grip strong and painful, and dragged me into the darkness. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The figure was too strong. It pulled me deeper into the void, the darkness swallowing me whole. And then I woke up, back in my bed, gasping for air, my arm throbbing with pain. I looked down and froze. There were bruises on my arm, dark finger-shaped bruises, exactly where the figure had grabbed me. That's when I knew it wasn't just a dream. Whatever was haunting my sleep was real. I tried to tell myself it wasn't possible, that it was just a coincidence, that I must have hit my arm in my sleep. But deep down, I knew the truth. The demon from my nightmares was real, and it was getting stronger. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I stopped sleeping, too afraid to close my eyes, but it didn't help. The figure would appear in the corners of my vision, just out of sight, watching me, waiting. I could feel its presence in my room at night, even when I was awake. The air would grow cold, and the shadows would seem to stretch and twist, moving on their own. Then one night, it finally happened. I was lying in bed trying to stay awake when I felt something cold wrap around my arm. I looked down and saw the figure's hand, black and twisted, gripping my arm. Before I could react, it yanked me out of bed, dragging me across the floor. I screamed, kicking and clawing at the ground with my free arm, but it was no use. The demon was too strong. It pulled me toward the closet, its glowing eyes the only thing visible in the darkness. I dug my nails into the carpet, trying to hold on, but the demon was relentless. It dragged me into the closet, the door slamming shut behind us. The darkness was complete, suffocating, and I could feel its breath on my neck, hot and foul. I knew this was it, that I was going to die, or worse, be taken somewhere far more terrifying. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The door burst open, light flooding the closet, and the demon let go. I scrambled out, my heart racing, my body trembling. The room was empty, the air still, but I could feel the demon's presence lingering, watching me, waiting for its next chance. I moved in with my mom after that, while I was looking for a new apartment to move to. I didn't care about the money, the lease, any of it. I just needed to get away. But even now, in a new place, I still feel it sometimes, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to close my eyes so it can drag me back into the darkness. I know it's not over, that it's just waiting for the right moment to strike again. They hunger for souls. When we first laid eyes on the house, it seemed like the perfect place to start our new life. My wife, Emily, and I had been searching for months, visiting countless homes that were either too small, too expensive, or too far from the city. But this one, a charming old house nestled on the outskirts of town, felt right. It had character, space, and a quiet, peaceful atmosphere that we both craved. It was autumn when we moved in, the air crisp with the scent of falling leaves. The house was surrounded by a thick grove of trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The realtor had mentioned that the house had been vacant for a while, but it was in good shape. Sure, it needed a little work, a fresh coat of paint, some new fixtures, but we were eager to make it our own. The first few weeks were spent unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting to know our new surroundings. We quickly fell into a routine, with me commuting to my job in the city and Emily working from home as a freelance writer. Everything felt normal, even idyllic. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, a sense of unease began to creep into our lives, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. It started with a cold spot. I was in the living room one evening, reading a book, when I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature that made me shiver. I looked up, expecting to see an open window, but everything was shut tight. I dismissed it as a draft and went back to my book, but the coldness persisted. It felt almost like someone was standing next to me, watching, but when I looked around, there was no one there. I mentioned it to Emily later that night, but she shrugged it off. "Old houses have drafts," she said, "and we'll probably need to get the insulation checked." She was right, of course. The house was over 100 years old, and it wasn't surprising that it had its quirks. But as the days passed, the cold spot didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to move around the house, appearing in different rooms at different times. Sometimes I'd feel it in the hallway, other times in the kitchen, and once, while I was lying in bed, I felt it hovering right above me, as if something cold and invisible was pressing down on my chest. I tried to ignore it, rationalize it, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something that wasn't just a draft or bad insulation. Then the whispering began. It was late one night, and I had just turned off the lights to go to bed. Emily was already asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering coming from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees outside, but as I strained to listen, I realized the sound was coming from inside the house. It was a low, indistinct murmur, like someone speaking just below the threshold of hearing. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, insistent, and somehow malevolent. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The house was silent except for the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. I checked every room, but there was nothing. No radio left on, no open windows, nothing that could explain the whispering. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking. After that night, the whispering became a regular occurrence. It would start at odd hours, usually late at night or early in the morning, when the house was at its quietest. Sometimes it was just a single voice. Other times it sounded like multiple voices overlapping, creating a chaotic, eerie cacophony. Emily didn't hear it at first. She was a heavy sleeper and usually slept through the night without waking. But one night I shook her awake when the whispering was particularly loud. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She blinked groggily, listening for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't hear anything, Dan. You're probably just tired." But I wasn't tired. I knew what I had heard, and the fact that she couldn't hear it only made me more uneasy. Things escalated from there. One evening, as Emily and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie, the power suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the glow of the fireplace. We sat in silence for a moment, waiting for the lights to come back on, but they didn't. "I'll check the breaker," I said, getting up from the couch. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed down to the basement, where the breaker panel was located. The basement was cold and damp, the concrete walls slick with moisture. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I felt a strange sense of dread, like I was being watched. I found the breaker panel and flipped the switch, but nothing happened. The power remained off. Frustrated, I turned to go back upstairs when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadowy figure standing in the far corner of the basement, barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was tall and indistinct, its form shifting and flickering like a wisp of smoke. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately, as if it was aware of my presence. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the beam of light spinning wildly before coming to rest on the empty corner. The figure was gone. I bolted up the stairs, my pulse racing. When I reached the top, I found Emily standing by the front door, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. I saw something," I stammered. "In the basement. It was a shadow, but it moved, like it was alive." She stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Dan, we need to leave." I nodded, not needing any convincing. We grabbed our coats, and without another word, we fled the house, not stopping until we were safely inside the car. The next morning, we went to the local historical society to see if we could dig up any information about the house. We were greeted by an elderly woman named Mrs. Carson, who seemed eager to help us with our search. As we pored over old records and newspaper clippings, we began to uncover the dark history of the house. It had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Samuel Bishop, a wealthy landowner with a reputation for being reclusive and eccentric. According to the records, Bishop had lived in the house alone for many years, rarely leaving the property. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house at night. screams, moans, and what sounded like chanting. The most disturbing part of the story, however, was how Bishop had died. In 1902, his body was found in the basement, burned beyond recognition. The cause of the fire was never determined, but there were rumors that Bishop had been involved in occult practices and that he had summoned something that had turned on him. As we read the accounts of his death, a sickening realization hit me. The cold spot, the whispering, the shadowy figure in the basement, it was all connected. Whatever Bishop had summoned all those years ago was still in the house, and it had latched onto us. We didn't return to the house that night. Instead, we checked into a hotel and spent hours discussing what to do next. The thought of going back to that house made my skin crawl, but it wasn't as simple as just leaving. We had invested so much in the place, and walking away felt like admitting defeat. But the more we talked, the more it became clear that staying wasn't an option. The house was haunted. Of that we were certain. And whatever was there, it wasn't going to let us live in peace. The next morning, we contacted a real estate agent and put the house on the market. We didn't tell them about the strange occurrences. Who would believe us? We just wanted out as quickly as possible. Within a month, the house was sold to a young couple, eager to start their new life in what they saw as a charming old home. We wished them well, but I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me. We hadn't warned them. They had no idea what they were walking into. Emily and I found a new place, a small modern apartment in the city. It was a far cry from the old house we had once dreamed of, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. We never spoke of the house again. It was as if we had made a silent pact to forget, to move on. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I sometimes found myself thinking about it. The cold spot, the whispering, the shadow in the basement. I wondered if the new owners had experienced anything yet, if they had felt the creeping dread that Emily and I had lived with. I wondered if they had heard the whispers in the walls, seen the shadows that moved on their own, or felt the oppressive cold that seemed to follow you around the house. But these were questions I was too afraid to seek answers to. Emily and I tried our best to put the past behind us. We focused on our work, our friends, and rebuilding our lives in a new place. Yet the memory of the house clung to me like a stain that couldn't be washed away. I often woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, convinced that I had heard the faint whispering again, only to realize that I was in a different place, safe from whatever haunted that house. But there was one last thing that happened, a small incident that still haunts me to this day. About 6 months after we had moved into our new apartment, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. When I did, there was a moment of static on the line before a woman's voice came through. "Is this Daniel?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Yes, this is Daniel," I replied, my gut tightening. "Who is this?" There was a pause, and then she spoke again. "My name is Laura. My husband and I bought your old house." My heart skipped a beat. "Yes, I remember. How are you?" Another pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end, shaky and uneven. "I don't know how to say this, but have you ever experienced anything strange in that house?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "What do you mean by strange?" She hesitated before answering. "Things moving on their own, cold spots, and voices whispering at night." My husband thinks I'm imagining things, but I know something's wrong." I closed my eyes, a wave of guilt washing over me. I had feared this day would come. "Listen, Laura, there's something you should know about that house." I told her everything, about the cold spots, the whispering, the shadows, and the history of Samuel Bishop. I didn't hold back. She needed to know the truth, even if it terrified her. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Laura spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What should we do?" "I wish I had a simple answer for you," I said, feeling the weight of my words. "But if I were you, I'd get out. Don't wait for it to get worse. Just leave." Laura didn't respond right away, but I could tell she was processing everything I had told her. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Thank you, Daniel. I don't know what we'll do, but thank you for telling me." The call ended, and I was left staring at the phone, feeling a deep sense of unease. I had done what I could, but I knew the house wasn't finished. It had a way of latching onto people, pulling them into its darkness. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Laura. She and her husband had decided to sell the house and move out, just as Emily and I had. She thanked me for my honesty and wished us well. But there was one thing she mentioned in her letter that I couldn't shake. She had been packing up the last of their belongings when she found something in the basement, an old charred piece of paper hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. It was brittle and crumbling, but the words scrawled on it were still legible. It was a warning, written by Samuel Bishop himself. The message was brief, but chilling. "Do not trust the whispers. They lie. They hunger for souls. Leave this place or be consumed." Laura didn't need any more convincing after that. They left the house that same day. As I read the letter, a cold chill ran down my spine. I could almost hear the whispers in the back of my mind, faint and distant but unmistakable. That night as I lay in bed, I felt a familiar sensation, a cold spot at the foot of the bed, just like the one in the old house. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering coming from somewhere in the room. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. I haven't heard the whispers since. But I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting, biding their time, waiting for someone else to stumble across that old house, to listen, to let them in. And if they do, I fear they won't be as lucky as we were. The thing under my bed. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but after what happened last year, I can't deny that some things defy explanation. I had just moved into a new apartment, a cozy one-bedroom in an old building downtown. It was charming in that way old buildings are, with creaky floors and drafty windows. The rent was cheap, and it was close to work, so I didn't mind the quirks. Everything was fine for the first few weeks. I'd come home from work, make dinner, and settle in for the night with a book or a movie. But then, I started noticing something strange. It began as a subtle feeling, an uneasy sensation that I wasn't alone in the apartment. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting just out of sight. At first, I brushed it off as nothing, my mind playing tricks on me in an unfamiliar place. But then, the nights grew worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing for no apparent reason. The feeling of being watched was stronger, oppressive even. I'd lie there, too terrified to move, straining my ears for any sound. And that's when I heard it. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood, coming from beneath my bed. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a rodent in the walls, but the noise persisted, growing louder each night, until it was impossible to ignore. One night, I finally worked up the courage to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I knelt beside my bed and slowly lifted the dust ruffle. The sight that greeted me nearly made me scream. There was nothing under my bed. No boxes, no storage bins, nothing but a dark, empty space. But in the middle of that space, something was moving. I could see the faint outline of a figure, its bony fingers clawing at the floorboards. Its body unnaturally long and thin, almost skeletal. The only thing I could make out clearly were its eyes, two burning red orbs staring back at me. I froze, unable to move or look away. The thing under my bed stopped scratching and slowly began to crawl toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed with fear, before something inside me snapped. I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet as I bolted for the door. I didn't stop running until I was outside, panting in the cold night air. I couldn't go back. I called a friend and crashed on their couch for the night, but I knew I couldn't avoid my apartment forever. The next day, I returned with a group of friends, hoping that in the daylight, everything would seem less terrifying. But when we got there, the place was empty. There was no sign of anything unusual under the bed, no scratches on the floor, nothing to indicate that what I had seen was real. But I know what I saw. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving the city altogether. I couldn't stay in that apartment, not after what happened. To this day, I still have nightmares about those burning red eyes, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up with that same feeling, that something is watching me from the darkness. The room at the end of the hall. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start. I wanted to leave everything behind. The memories, the arguments, the heartbreak, and find a place where I could start over. That's how I ended up in that old Victorian house. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered brick, peeling paint, and overgrown weeds. But it had potential, and more importantly, it was affordable. The house was bigger than I needed, with 3 stories and more rooms than I knew what to do with. But it had a certain charm, a character that I found appealing. I imagined myself fixing it up, turning it into something beautiful. It was exactly the kind of project I needed to keep my mind off the past. The first few weeks were spent cleaning, painting, and unpacking. I had moved in during the late fall, and the weather was already turning cold. The heating system was ancient, but it worked well enough, and I was able to make the place feel warm and cozy. I didn't mind the creaks and groans of the old house. They were just part of its personality, or so I told myself. There was only one part of the house I didn't like, the room at the end of the hall on the 2nd floor. It was small and oddly shaped, with a single narrow window that let in very little light. The previous owners had painted the walls a dull grey, and the floorboards were scuffed and worn. There was something about the room that made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I kept the door closed and avoided it as much as possible. It wasn't long before I started to notice strange things happening around the house. It began with little things. Doors that would open on their own, lights flickering, and cold drafts that would come out of nowhere. I chalked it up to the age of the house. After all, old houses had their quirks, right? But then the dreams started. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the image of that room at the end of the hall burned into my mind. In the dreams, I would be standing in front of the closed door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, terrified to open it. I could feel something on the other side, something dark and malevolent, waiting for me to let it in. During the day, I tried to brush off the dreams as just my imagination running wild. But as the days went on, the unease I felt around the house grew stronger. I started to hear noises at night, soft whispers like someone talking in the next room, and the faint sound of footsteps pacing back and forth upstairs. The worst part was that the noises always seemed to be coming from that room at the end of the hall. One day, while I was at the local hardware store picking up some supplies, I struck up a conversation with the owner, an older man named Frank. He had lived in the town his whole life and knew a lot about the area, so I asked him if he knew anything about my house. "Oh, that place," Frank said, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, I know it. That house has been around for a long time. Built back in the 1890s, if I remember right. It's been through a lot of owners over the years." "What happened to them?" I asked, suddenly curious. Frank hesitated, then shrugged. "Different things. Some moved away. Others, well, they didn't stay long. There's been talk, about that place. Rumors. People say it's haunted." I laughed nervously. "Haunted? By what?" Frank's expression turned serious. "There was a family that lived there back in the 1930s. The father, Richard Bain, was a banker. Lost everything during the Great Depression. He couldn't handle it. One night, he snapped. His wife and 2 daughters. No, it's too horrible to talk about." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And the room at the end of the hall?" Frank nodded slowly. "That was one of the daughters' rooms. They say you can still hear her crying sometimes, late at night. Some folks think it's her spirit, trapped there, waiting for her father to come back." I left the store with a heavy feeling in my chest. I didn't want to believe the stories, but they explained a lot about the strange occurrences in the house. I told myself that ghosts weren't real, that there had to be a rational explanation for everything. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. Frank's words kept echoing in my head, and the house seemed more ominous than ever. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to relax. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A soft, muffled sound coming from upstairs. It was crying. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was faint, almost like it was coming from far away, but it was unmistakable. A child's cry, filled with sorrow and fear. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall. I wanted to ignore it, to pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but something compelled me to get out of bed. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and slowly made my way upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the second floor, the crying stopped. The hallway was dark and silent. The door to the room at the end of the hall closed as always. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my hand trembling as I raised the flashlight. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer, no sound at all, but the air felt different, thicker, colder. I could feel something in the room, something that didn't belong. My heart raced as I took a step closer, then another, until I was standing right in front of the door. I reached out with my free hand, my fingers brushing against the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Small, dark, and unwelcoming. The grey walls seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, making the shadows dance along the floor and ceiling. The narrow window was shut tight, and the air was stale and musty. But there was something else. Something in the corner of the room, near the window. A dark shape, barely visible in the dim light. I shined the flashlight on it, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a little girl, sitting with her back to me, her long hair hanging down in tangled strands. She wore a white nightgown, and her shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. There was no way this could be real. But the girl was there, as clear as day, and she was crying. "Hello," I stammered, my voice trembling. The girl stopped crying. She slowly lowered her hands and turned her head to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. But there was something else. Something dark and twisted beneath the surface. Something that filled me with a sense of dread so intense that I nearly dropped the flashlight. She smiled. It was a cruel, twisted smile, filled with malice and hatred. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, freezing me in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as the girl slowly stood up, her limbs moving unnaturally, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice no longer that of a child. It was deeper, more guttural, filled with venom. "This is my home. Get out of here." The shadows in the room seemed to close in around me, the darkness growing thicker and more oppressive. The girl took a step forward, and I could see her features shifting, distorting into something monstrous, something that no longer resembled a human being. I finally found the strength to move. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and bolted out of the room. I slammed the door behind me and ran down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold night air, gasping for breath. I didn't go back inside the house that night. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in the driveway, the engine running to keep me warm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those hollow eyes, that twisted smile, the darkness that surrounded her. As soon as the sun came up, I went back into the house, grabbed my things, and left. I didn't care about the furniture or the boxes I left behind. I just needed to get out of there. I called a moving company and arranged for them to collect my belongings later, but I knew I'd never set foot in that house again. I drove to the nearest motel, where I holed up for a few days, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about the girl and the darkness in that room. I knew I couldn't tell anyone. They'd think I was crazy. But I also knew I couldn't go back to that house. Finally, I decided to sell it. I contacted a realtor and told her I needed to get rid of the place as quickly as possible. She didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated, and within a few weeks I had found a buyer. I didn't tell them about the history of the house, about what I had experienced. I couldn't. I just wanted it to be over. But even after I moved into a new place, far away from that house, I couldn't escape the memories. The nightmares came almost every night, always the same, standing in front of that closed door, knowing what was on the other side, but unable to turn away. Sometimes in the dead of night, I would wake up and swear I could hear that soft, muffled crying, as if it were coming from another room in my new home. But when I would get up to check, there was nothing there. I don't know if the girl, or whatever she was, is still in that house, waiting for her next victim. I try not to think about it, but deep down, I know that some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed, and some things, once awakened, can never be put back to sleep. As for me, I've learned my lesson. There are places in this world where the past lingers, where the dead don't rest, and where the darkness is always watching, waiting for someone to let it in. And I know now that I'll never be able to forget what I saw in that room at the end of the hall. I just hope that wherever I go, it doesn't follow me. The lost signal. It all started with a late-night drive through the mountains. I was heading home from visiting a friend who lived in a remote cabin, tucked away deep in the woods. The road was winding, narrow, and completely devoid of any other cars. It was the kind of road that made you feel utterly alone in the world, with nothing but the hum of your engine and the occasional rustle of the trees to keep you company. I'd been driving for about an hour when my phone buzzed with a notification. Surprised to get any signal out here, I glanced at the screen and saw an alert. Emergency broadcast, severe weather warning. I frowned. The skies were clear, not a cloud in sight, but I figured it was just a glitch. These mountains were notorious for unpredictable weather, so I didn't think much of it and kept driving. A few minutes later, the radio cut out. Static filled the car, the kind that buzzes and hisses, almost like a whisper. I tried to change the station, but every single one was the same, just static. That's when I noticed the temperature dropping. The car's thermometer showed the outside temp plummeting, faster than it should have been, given the clear night. I turned up the heat, but the cold seeped in, like a creeping fog. Suddenly, out of the static, a voice broke through. It was faint, crackling, but I could make out the words, "Help. Me." The voice was distorted, garbled like it was coming from a broken tape, and it sent a chill down my spine. I turned the volume up, straining to hear more, but the voice faded back into the static, leaving me alone with the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. As I rounded a bend, the headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the asphalt, and the car skidded to a stop just inches from the figure. My heart raced as I realized it was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her hair hanging wet and limp around her face. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I rolled down the window, my voice trembling as I asked, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. Her eyes bore into mine, and a wave of unease washed over me. Something about her wasn't right. She looked out of place, like she'd stepped out of a different time, a different world. Before I could say anything else, she pointed down the road, her hand trembling. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling static still spilling from the radio. "They're coming and they won't stop." I didn't wait to find out who or what she was talking about. I hit the gas, swerving around her and speeding down the road. My heart was in my throat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove, the temperature continued to drop, and the static on the radio grew louder, more insistent. The voice returned, clearer this time, repeating the same words over and over. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" And then I saw them, figures emerging from the woods, dozens of them, all dressed in the same white gowns, their faces blank, eyes hollow. They were walking toward the road, toward me, their movements slow but purposeful. The static on the radio reached a deafening pitch, drowning out everything else, and the temperature inside the car plummeted. I floored the gas, pushing the car to its limits as I sped away from the figures, away from the cold, away from the voices. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the figures long behind me, the static fading into silence. When I finally pulled over to catch my breath, the radio came back on clear as day, playing a song like nothing had happened. The temperature was back to normal, the night was still and quiet, and there was no sign of the woman or the figures in white. I never drove that road at night again. Whatever I'd seen, whatever had happened, I didn't want to risk it a second time. And every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, and the radio cuts out, just for a second, I remember those hollow eyes and that whispering voice, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone to help them. Strong faith. For 4 years, our life had been as close to perfect as anyone could hope for. Hannah and I moved into our quaint little house in a quiet neighborhood shortly after we got married. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 2-story home with a small garden in the back and a cozy living room where we spent countless evenings curled up on the couch. It was the kind of place that made you feel safe, a place that felt like home the moment you walked through the door. We had our routines, our jobs, our friends, and we were happy. There was no hint of anything unusual, no bumps in the night, no cold spots, no eerie feelings, just us, living our lives. It's funny how you never realize how fragile that sense of normalcy is until something comes along and shatters it. In our case, that something happened on a cold, moonless night in late October. Hannah had gone out with her friends for the evening, just a casual night at the pub followed by a visit to Paula's house. I had stayed home, content to watch some television and wait for her to come back. Around midnight, she texted me to say she was on her way home. I offered to meet her halfway since it was late and the streets were dark. She agreed, and I set out to meet her. We always used a shortcut that cut through the old cemetery at the edge of town. It was a little creepy at night, sure, but it saved us 10 minutes of walking, and we had never had any reason to be afraid. But that night, something was different. I felt it the moment I stepped through the cemetery gates. A heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. When I reached the middle of the cemetery, I saw Hannah coming toward me. She was moving quickly, her head down, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if trying to ward off the chill. I called out to her and she looked up, her face pale and drawn. "Patrick," she whispered when she reached me, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong. I saw something." "What do you mean?" I asked, frowning. "What did you see?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. I followed her gaze, but all I saw were the shadowy outlines of headstones and trees swaying gently in the wind. "There!" she cried, pointing toward the darkness. "Do you see them? Those figures?" I squinted, trying to make out what she was talking about, but there was nothing there. "Hannah, I don't see anything," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you sure?" She grabbed my arm, her grip tight and desperate. "I'm sure. They were right there. 3 of them, black as shadows, just standing there watching me. Oh God, Patrick, they were so close." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't see anything, but the fear in Hannah's voice was unmistakable. Whatever she thought she saw, it had terrified her, and that was enough to make me uneasy. "Let's get out of here," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll talk about it when we get home." Hannah nodded, still glancing nervously behind her, and we hurried out of the cemetery, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. We didn't speak again until we were back inside the safety of our house. But even then, the chill of that night clung to us like a damp fog. It wasn't until we were home, with the door locked behind us and the lights on, that Hannah finally started to calm down. She sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of tea I'd made for her. I sat beside her, waiting for her to speak, to tell me what had happened. "It was after we left the pub," she began slowly, her voice still shaky. "Paula suggested we go back to her place for a bit, just to hang out. You know how she is, always looking for something fun to do. When we got there, she brought out an old spirit board. You know, one of those Ouija boards." My stomach tightened at the mention of the board. I wasn't particularly superstitious, but I'd heard enough stories to know that messing with those things could lead to trouble. Still, I tried to keep an open mind. "We were just playing around at first," Hannah continued. "Asking silly questions, waiting for something to happen. But then, it started moving. The planchette, I mean. It just moved on its own." She shuddered at the memory, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "Did anyone push it?" I asked, trying to stay rational. "I don't think so," she said, shaking her head. "None of us were laughing or joking anymore. It was just moving, spelling out words. Death, danger, stay away. Then it said a name. Samael." "Samael?" I repeated, the name sending a chill down my spine. I'd heard it before, though I couldn't remember where. Hannah nodded. "That's when we stopped. It didn't feel like a game anymore. We all felt it. Something wrong. Something dark. I left soon after that, and you know the rest." I sat there, trying to process what she had told me. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Maybe it was the way Hannah's hands still trembled, or the way her eyes darted nervously around the room, as if expecting something to jump out of the shadows. "We shouldn't have done it," she whispered. "I feel like we opened a door, and now I feel like something's following me, Patrick." I wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was all in her head, but the truth was, I wasn't so sure myself. The cemetery, the figures, the name from the board, it all felt connected somehow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just stepped into something far beyond our understanding. The first night after the cemetery incident was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Hannah and I went to bed early, exhausted from the night's events, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made me tense up, expecting something to happen. But nothing did. It wasn't until the following day that things started to change. It was subtle at first, Just small things that were easy to brush off. Objects moved from where we'd left them, lights flickering even though the bulbs were new, strange noises in the middle of the night that we couldn't quite place. Hannah tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. She became jumpy, nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting to see something lurking there. And then, about a week later, she saw them again. The figures. It was late at night, and we were both in bed trying to get some sleep. I had just started to doze off when Hannah suddenly sat up, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Patrick! They're here!" she whispered, her voice filled with terror. I jolted awake, my heart racing. "What? What's here?" "The figures," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "They're standing at the foot of the bed. Can't you see them?" I looked where she was pointing, but again I saw nothing. Just the darkness of our bedroom, the faint outline of furniture in the moonlight. "There's nothing there, Hannah," I said, trying to soothe her. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." "No," she cried, her voice rising in panic. "They're real, Patrick. They're right there, staring at me." She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. I reached out to hold her, to comfort her, but as soon as I touched her, she screamed. A blood-curdling scream that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't touch me," she sobbed, pulling away from me. They're angry. They don't want you near me." I froze, unsure of what to do. I wanted to help her, to make it stop, but I felt completely helpless. It was like she was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake her from, and I was powerless to protect her. Eventually, she calmed down, but the terror in her eyes didn't fade. She curled up on her side of the bed, clutching the blankets around her, as if they could shield her from whatever she thought was there. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching over her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed in the room with us, even if I couldn't see it. As the days passed, the situation grew worse. Hannah's fear turned into paranoia. She became convinced that the figures were following her everywhere she went, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She started avoiding the bedroom altogether, refusing to sleep there. She insisted on leaving the lights on in every room, even during the day. I tried to be patient, to understand what she was going through, but it was hard. I felt like I was losing her, like the woman I had married was slipping away from me. I suggested seeing a therapist, but Hannah refused. She was convinced that this wasn't something a doctor could fix. "It's not in my head, Patrick," she would say, her voice desperate. "They're real. I can feel them all the time. They're always watching me." I didn't know what to believe anymore. I wanted to help her, to save her, but I didn't know how. I started doing research, reading everything I could find about spirit boards, hauntings, and the name Samael. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Samael, it turned out, was a name associated with various dark figures in mythology, an angel of death, a destroyer, a demon. The stories varied, but the common thread was that he was a malevolent entity, one that thrived on fear and despair. And it seemed that by using the spirit board, Hannah and her friends had somehow drawn his attention. I didn't tell Hannah what I had learned. She was already terrified, and I didn't want to make things worse. But the more I read, the more I started to believe that this wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Something had latched onto her that night. something dark and dangerous, and it wasn't going to let go easily. The breaking point came about a month after the cemetery incident. By then, Hannah was a shadow of her former self, pale, gaunt, exhausted from lack of sleep. The fear had consumed her, and I was at my wits' end. I didn't know how much more either of us could take. One night, I woke up to find Hannah standing in the living room, staring out the window. Her face was blank, her eyes wide and unblinking. I called her name, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring out into the darkness. "Hannah?" I said again, more loudly this time. "What are you doing?" "They're outside," she whispered. "They're waiting for me." I moved to her side, trying to pull her away from the window, but she resisted, her gaze still fixed on whatever she thought she saw out there. "They want me to go with them," she said in a flat, emotionless voice. "They won't stop until I do." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what she was saying. These figures, whatever they were, had been tormenting her for weeks, wearing her down, breaking her spirit. And now, it seemed, they were trying to claim her. "No," I said firmly, pulling her away from the window. "You're not going anywhere. We're going to figure this out, Hannah. We'll get help." But she shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "It's too late, Patrick. I can feel them, inside me. They're taking me." Panic gripped me as I realized how close I was to losing her. I couldn't let that happen. I had to do something, anything, to stop it. "Stay here," I said, rushing to the phone. I called Father O'Connor, a local priest I had met a few times. He was an older man, kind and wise, and I hoped that he could help, or at least offer some guidance. To my relief, Father O'Connor agreed to come over right away. He arrived within the hour, carrying a Bible and a small vial of holy water. He took one look at Hannah and knew something was seriously wrong. "Tell me everything," he said, and I quickly explained what had been happening. Hannah's encounter with the figures, the spirit board, the haunting. Father O'Connor listened carefully, then nodded grimly. "This is not something to be taken lightly," he said. "If what you're saying is true, then your wife is in grave danger. We must act quickly." He began a series of prayers, blessing each room of the house with holy water. Hannah watched silently, her expression vacant, as if she were no longer fully present. When Father O'Connor reached the living room, where Hannah had seen the figures, he paused, his face growing pale. "There's something here," he said quietly. "Something dark." He continued his prayers, but as he did, the room grew colder and a sense of dread settled over us. Hannah suddenly cried out, clutching her head as if in pain. "They're angry!" she screamed. "They're coming for me!" Father O'Connor moved quickly, placing the crucifix against her forehead and commanding the entity to leave. Hannah convulsed, her eyes rolling back in her head as she let out a guttural, inhuman scream. For what felt like an eternity, the room was filled with that terrible sound, until finally Hannah dropped, unconscious, onto the floor. The air seemed to clear, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a great weight had been removed. Father O'Connor knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "She's alive," he said with relief. "But whatever was here, it's not gone. Not entirely." Hannah woke up a few hours later, disoriented but alive. The experience had taken a toll on her, but for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Is it over?" she asked weakly. "I don't know," I admitted. but Father O'Connor thinks we've weakened it. We need to stay strong, Hannah. We can beat this. Father O'Connor advised us to keep the house blessed regularly, to pray, and to avoid anything that could attract dark spirits. But he also warned us that the figures might try to return, especially if they felt we were vulnerable. For a while, things seemed to improve. The house felt lighter, Hannah's health improved, and the figures didn't reappear. We began to think that maybe, just maybe, we had defeated whatever had been haunting us. But then, one night the figures returned. It was late, and Hannah and I were sitting in the living room, watching TV. The air grew cold, and the lights began to flicker. Hannah's face went white, and she grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. "They're here," she whispered. Before I could react, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, coalescing into the 3 dark figures Hannah had described. They were more solid now, more real, their forms dark and menacing, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "They want to take me," Hannah said, her voice filled with despair. "Patrick, they're too strong." "No," I said fiercely, standing between her and the figures. "You can't have her. She's mine." The figures didn't speak, but I could feel their hatred, their hunger. They moved closer, their presence suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Desperate, I grabbed the crucifix Father O'Connor had left with us and held it out toward the figures. "In the name of God, leave this house," I shouted, my voice trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. The figures loomed closer, their eyes locked on Hannah. But then, as if repelled by some unseen force, they stopped, hesitated. The glow in their eyes flickered, and they began to fade, their forms dissolving back into the shadows. I kept the crucifix raised, repeating the prayer over and over until the room was silent, the figures gone. Hannah collapsed into my arms, sobbing with relief. "They're gone," she whispered. "You saved me, Patrick." I held her tightly, too shaken to speak. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The figures might be gone for now, but I could still feel their presence, lurking just beyond the edge of reality, waiting for another chance to strike. In the weeks that followed, we did everything we could to cleanse the house. We brought in a professional exorcist, had the house blessed again, and kept our faith strong. Slowly, the atmosphere improved, and Hannah's fear began to fade. We never spoke of that night again, but we both knew the truth. Whatever had attached itself to Hannah that night in the cemetery had been driven back, but it was never truly gone. It was out there, waiting. Eventually, we decided to move. We left the house behind, starting fresh in a new town, far away from the memories of those dark days. Hannah recovered, though the experience left its mark on both of us. We learned to live with the shadows that still lingered in the corners of our minds, always there, always watching. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the darkness feels too close, I think back to that cold October night, to the figures in the cemetery, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for another chance to claim what they believe is theirs. But as long as we keep our faith strong, we will always win against the darkness. The man in the mirror. It started about a week after we moved into the new apartment. My wife and I were thrilled to finally have a place of our own, a cozy little unit in a quiet building on the edge of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was ours, and we were happy. The apartment had a few quirks: the creaky floorboards, the odd draft that seemed to come from nowhere, but we chalked it up to the building's age. The one thing that stood out, though, was the mirror in the hallway. It was an old full-length mirror mounted on the wall, its frame ornate and slightly tarnished. We figured it was a leftover from the previous tenants, but it had a certain charm, so we decided to keep it. The first time I noticed something strange was late one night. My wife had gone to bed early, and I was up watching TV in the living room. As I walked down the hallway to the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, but when I turned to look, I saw him. There was a man standing in the mirror, staring back at me. He was tall and thin, with a mean face and deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into me. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from a century ago. His expression was blank, almost as if he was in a trance. I froze. My blood turned to ice. The man didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there staring at me. I took a step back, and he did the same. I raised my hand, and he mirrored the motion perfectly. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some weird optical illusion, but there was something about the way he moved that felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too real. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the man was gone. It was just me in the mirror, looking pale and shaken. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe a result of too little sleep and too much stress from the move. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked past the mirror, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I started avoiding the hallway, using the bathroom in the master bedroom instead, and leaving the lights on at night. My wife noticed I was acting strange, but I didn't want to tell her what I'd seen. I didn't want her to think I was losing it. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, she mentioned the mirror. "Have you noticed anything weird about it?" she asked casually, brushing her hair in front of the bathroom mirror. I hesitated. "Like what?" "I don't know. I just feel like there's something off about it. Sometimes I think I see someone else in there, like a shadow or something." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Maybe it's just old," I said, trying to hide my fear. "Old mirrors can be a little creepy." She nodded, but I could see the unease in her eyes. We didn't talk about it again, but the tension in the apartment grew with each passing day. The breaking point came one night when I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My wife was sound asleep next to me, so it couldn't have been her. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they stopped right outside our bedroom door. I held my breath, listening. The door creaked open, and I felt a rush of cold air sweep into the room. I turned over slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the door swinging open on its own. And then I saw him again. The man from the mirror was standing in the doorway, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He was closer this time, so close I could see the dark circles under his eyes, the way his skin seemed to hang off his bones. He took a step forward, and I could hear the floorboards creak under his weight. I wanted to scream, to wake my wife, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, frozen in place by some unseen force. The man took another step closer, his hand reaching out toward me, and I finally found my voice. "Get out!" I yelled, my voice shaking with fear. "Get out of here!" The man stopped, his hand hovering inches from my face. For a moment, I thought he might actually listen, but then his lips curled into a slow, sinister smile. He leaned in closer, and I could feel the cold emanating from him, seeping into my bones. "Fear," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but somehow it echoed in my mind. "Fear. I'll be back for more." With that, he stepped back, fading into the shadows of the hallway. The door slammed shut, and I was left alone in the darkness, my heart racing. The next morning, we packed our things and left the apartment. We didn't say much to each other, just threw our belongings into boxes and got out as fast as we could. We found a new place after a couple of weeks, and I made sure it didn't have any mirrors. I don't know who or what that man was, but I knew better than to stick around and find out. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of myself in a mirror and wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to move into that apartment, waiting for another chance to feed on fear. The unseen force. I never believed in the paranormal, not really. Sure, I enjoyed the occasional horror movie, the thrill of ghost stories shared around a campfire, but I always considered them nothing more than entertainment. That is until the strange occurrences began in the apartment I shared with my partner, Lisa. What started as minor inconveniences soon escalated into a living nightmare, and I now find myself questioning everything I once dismissed as fantasy. We moved into the apartment in late autumn, drawn by its charming old-world architecture and the affordable rent. The place was a bit run down, but it had character, high ceilings, large windows that let in the morning light, and creaky wooden floors that added to its charm. It was our first home together, and we were excited to make it our own. The first few weeks were uneventful. We spent our time unpacking, decorating, and getting used to our new routine. The building was quiet, the neighbours friendly, and life seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm. But then, subtle things began to happen, things that were easy to brush off at first. It started with small objects going missing, a set of keys, Lisa's favourite necklace, a book I had been reading. We chalked it up to the chaos of moving, assuming they would turn up eventually. Sometimes they did, in the most unlikely places, keys in the refrigerator, the necklace inside a book, the book itself wedged between couch cushions. We laughed it off, blaming our tired minds and the disarray of unpacking. Then came the sounds. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable creaks and groans that we attributed to the old building settling. But soon, the noises grew louder and more persistent. We'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside our door late at night, when no one was there, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor above us, even though the apartment upstairs was vacant. Occasionally, there would be a loud bang, as if something had fallen or been thrown, but we could never find the source. One night, as we lay in bed, a loud crash startled us both awake. It sounded as if a piece of furniture had been overturned in the living room. We rushed out to investigate, but everything was in its place. Not a single item was disturbed, yet the noise had been so loud and so real, we couldn't deny it. We searched the apartment, trying to find an explanation, but there was nothing. We returned to bed, unease settling in our stomachs, but convinced it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. As the days went by, the disturbances grew more intense. Lights would flicker for no reason, and electrical appliances would turn on and off by themselves. One evening, we were watching TV when it suddenly turned off. Lisa got up to check the remote, thinking maybe it needed new batteries, but the TV turned back on by itself before she could even touch it. We stared at each other in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Maybe it's just faulty wiring," Lisa suggested, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. "This place is pretty old after all." "Yeah, probably," I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. The final straw came one night when we were both awakened by the sound of something shattering in the kitchen. We bolted out of bed and ran to the source of the noise, only to find every single cabinet door wide open, dishes and glasses scattered across the floor, many of them broken. The sheer violence of it all was staggering, as if someone or something had torn through the kitchen in a fit of rage. Lisa began to cry, and I could feel my own fear bubbling up inside me. We cleaned up the mess in silence, our minds racing with thoughts we dared not voice. We couldn't keep denying it anymore. Something was very wrong with our apartment. The next day, we decided to do some research on the building. We visited the local library and dug through old records, trying to find any clue as to what might be causing the disturbances. What we found was chilling. The building had a long history, dating back to the early 1900s, and over the years it had been the site of several tragedies. The most notable was a fire in the 1920s that claimed the lives of a family who lived in our apartment. According to the records, the fire started in the kitchen, spreading quickly through the small space. The mother and 2 children were trapped inside, unable to escape the flames. The father, who had been out at work, returned home to find his family dead. Distraught and unable to bear the grief, he took his own life in the very apartment where we now lived. The more we read, the more it seemed that our apartment had a dark, malevolent presence. The tragedies that had occurred within its walls had left a mark, and that mark was making itself known to us. We were dealing with a poltergeist, a violent and disruptive spirit that was intent on making our lives a living hell. But even with this knowledge, we were unsure of what to do. We couldn't afford to break our lease and move out, and we weren't sure if leaving would even solve the problem. Poltergeists, as we understood from our research, were often attached to people rather than places. What if it followed us? We decided to try to confront whatever was haunting us. We reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Claire, who had a reputation for dealing with these kinds of cases. She agreed to come to the apartment and see if she could help. Claire arrived the next evening, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with a calm demeanour that immediately put us at ease. She brought with her a collection of tools, cameras, audio recorders, and various devices I didn't recognise. "Let's see what we're dealing with," she said, as she began setting up her equipment around the apartment. For the next few hours, Claire conducted a series of tests, asking questions to the empty air, recording sounds, and taking temperature readings. At first, nothing happened, and I could see Lisa beginning to relax. Maybe it had all been in our heads, we thought. Maybe we were just stressed from the move, and our imaginations had gotten the better of us. But then, as Claire stood in the kitchen, the very spot where the fire had started, her expression changed. She stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she stared at something we couldn't see. "There's definitely something here," she said quietly. "Something very angry." At that moment, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could see my breath fogging in the air, and Lisa shivered beside me. The lights began to flicker, and a low, rumbling growl filled the room, seeming to come from all around us. "Show yourself," Claire commanded, her voice firm. "We're not afraid of you." The growling intensified, and suddenly, the cabinets burst open once again, their contents spilling onto the floor with a deafening crash. Claire didn't flinch, but Lisa and I jumped back, our hearts pounding. "You need to leave this place," Claire said, her tone brooking no argument. "You're not welcome here." The growl turned into a roar, and a gust of wind tore through the apartment, knocking over furniture and slamming doors. Lisa clung to me, her face pale with fear, and I could feel my own terror rising. This wasn't something we could fight or reason with. It was a force of pure rage, lashing out at us with all the fury of a soul that had been wronged. Claire held her ground, repeating her command for the spirit to leave. Slowly, the chaos began to subside. The wind died down, the lights stabilized, and the growl faded into silence. For a moment, the apartment was still, the air heavy with tension. "Is it gone?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I think so," Claire said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. She finished her work and packed up her equipment, giving us instructions on how to cleanse the apartment and protect ourselves from further attacks. We thanked her, though we were still shaken by the experience. Over the next few days, we followed Claire's advice, burning sage and sprinkling salt around the apartment's perimeter. The disturbances did seem to lessen, though they never fully disappeared. We'd still hear the occasional thud or see objects out of place, but it was nothing like the chaos we had experienced before. We stayed in the apartment until our lease was up, too afraid to break it, but too scared to stay any longer than necessary. When we finally moved out, we left everything behind: furniture, dishes, even clothes. We didn't want to take anything that might carry a trace of the entity with us. Now, in our new home, we try to forget what happened, though the memories still haunt us. We've made a pact never to speak of it, to pretend it was all just a bad dream. But every so often, I'll catch Lisa staring into space, her brow furrowed in thought, and I know she's remembering, just as I do. I've come to realize that some places are marked by the past, by the tragedies that occurred there, and those marks can never truly be erased. The apartment we lived in is one of those places, a place where something dark and angry still lingers, waiting for the next unsuspecting tenants to move in. The door. I've lived in the same apartment for nearly 5 years now. It's nothing special, just a small, one-bedroom place in an older building. The walls are thin, the plumbing is questionable, and the neighbours are, well, they're neighbours. It's affordable though, and that's what matters when you're living paycheck to paycheck. It started a few weeks ago. I came home from work, exhausted from another long day, and as I was about to unlock my door, I noticed something odd. There was a door at the end of the hallway that I had never seen before. Now I know what you're thinking. How could I miss a door in my own hallway? But trust me, it wasn't there before. The hallway is short, and there's only one other apartment on this floor, so I would have noticed. I walked over to the door, curiosity piqued. It was an old wooden door, chipped and faded as if it hadn't been touched in years. There was no number on it, no peephole, nothing to indicate that it was even an apartment. Just a plain, unremarkable door. I tried the handle, but it was locked. Figuring it was just an old storage room or something, I shrugged it off and went into my apartment. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the door. It was strange. Why would a door suddenly appear in a building I'd lived in for years? But as the days passed, I managed to push it to the back of my mind. Work was getting more demanding, and I didn't have the energy to dwell on something as trivial as a door. Then the noises started. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I thought it was a rat or some other pest, and I told the landlord about it. He promised to send someone to check it out, but days passed and nothing changed. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way out from behind the walls. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. But this time, it was accompanied by a soft, almost inaudible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. It sent chills down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, a result of too many late nights and too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I decided to investigate the door again. It was still there, as old and unremarkable as before. I tried the handle again, and to my surprise, it turned slightly, as if the door had been unlocked. But when I pushed, it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was blocking it from the other side. That night, the noises got worse. The scratching was frantic now, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could hear words now, though they were distorted, as if coming from a great distance. "Help! Please! Let me out!" I could barely sleep. And when I did, my dreams were plagued with images of that door, of something terrible waiting behind it. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and my toolbox, determined to open that door once and for all. I didn't care what I found behind it. I just needed to know. I approached the door, my hands trembling. The hallway was eerily silent, the only sound the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I tried the handle again, and this time, it turned all the way. The door creaked open just a crack, enough for me to peer inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with the stench of decay. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. Something moved in the darkness. A shape, hunched and twisted, shuffling towards the door. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. It was wrong, like a person, but not. Its limbs were too long, its face a grotesque mask of pain and hunger. Its eyes were empty sockets, and yet I felt them boring into me, filled with a malevolent, desperate need. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I could hear it on the other side, scratching, pounding, whispering those terrible words. "Let me out. Please, let me out." I ran back to my apartment, bolted the door, and huddled on the couch, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The noises continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. I tried to tell the landlord, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no door there," he said, his voice tinged with confusion. "That's just a wall." I couldn't believe it. I ran back to the hallway, but the door was gone. Just a blank, featureless wall where it had been. I pounded on it, screaming, but there was no answer. No scratching, no whispers, nothing. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something truly terrible is hiding in the walls of this building. But every night I can still hear it, scratching, whispering, begging to be let out. And I'm terrified that one day I won't be able to resist. One day I'll open that door and let whatever it is inside. And when I do, I don't think I'll be the same person anymore. If you're reading this, if you ever find yourself in a place where a door shouldn't be, don't open it. Don't even look at it. Just turn around and walk away. Who knows what awaits behind there? The last stop. It was late, and the road stretched out endlessly before me, dark and desolate. I was on my way back home after a grueling business trip, trying to make it through the night on caffeine and adrenaline. The highway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you feel like the only person left in the world. It was around 2 a.m. when I realized I needed to stop for gas. My tank was nearly empty, and I hadn't seen a gas station for miles. Just as my anxiety started to build, I spotted a small gas station sign flickering in the distance. Relieved, I pulled off the highway and rolled into the station. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, with a single ancient-looking pump and a dilapidated convenience store. I didn't see anyone around, but the lights were on inside. I parked by the pump and got out, shivering in the chilly night air. As I fumbled with the pump, trying to figure out if it even worked, I heard a noise behind me. I turned and saw a man standing just outside the store's door, barely visible in the dim light. He was tall and thin, wearing a faded plaid shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite place. His posture was unnaturally stiff, and he stood motionless, staring at me. I forced a smile and gave a half-hearted wave, but he didn't respond. Unease crept over me. The man continued to stand there, silent and still, like a statue. I quickly turned back to the pump, deciding that getting my gas and leaving as fast as possible was the best course of action. The pump was slow, the numbers ticking up agonizingly slowly. I felt exposed and vulnerable in the dim light. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that the man had moved closer, now standing near the edge of the light from the store's windows. My pulse quickened. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my hands were shaking. Finally, the tank was full. I replaced the nozzle and hurried into the store to pay. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and dust. The interior was as outdated as the exterior, with old magazines and snacks lining the shelves. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh glow over everything. I approached the counter, but there was no one there. The man from outside had disappeared. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. I looked around, trying to spot anyone, but the place was deserted. Just as I was about to leave the money on the counter and bolt, a door behind the counter creaked open. An old woman stepped out, her face pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy and thin. "Just paying for gas," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I handed her a 20 and she took it without a word. As she made change, I noticed something strange. On the wall behind her, there were dozens of photographs, all of the same man in different locations around the station. It was the man from outside, his expression always the same blank stare. I couldn't help but ask, "Who is that man in the pictures?" The old woman paused, her eyes narrowing. "That was my son," she said slowly. "He passed away a long time ago." A chill ran down my spine. "Passed away? But I just saw him outside." She stared at me for a moment, then shook her head. "You must be mistaken. There's no one else here." I felt a surge of panic. I grabbed my change and rushed out of the store. As I stepped outside, I saw the man again, standing by the pump where my car was parked. He was closer this time, his face partially illuminated by the light. I could see his eyes now, dark and hollow, and his skin had a strange waxy sheen to it. Without thinking, I ran to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. The man didn't move. He just watched as I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the gas station, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I sped away, expecting to see the man still standing there. But there was nothing, just the empty, dimly lit station fading into the distance. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I pulled into a well-lit, busy gas station and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't shake the image of that man, those lifeless eyes, and the way he seemed to watch me with an unnatural intensity. Later, I tried to find out more about the gas station and the old woman. I asked around in the nearby town, but no one knew what I was talking about. They insisted there was no gas station on that stretch of road, not for miles. I even drove back during the day, but all I found was an old boarded-up building, long abandoned and covered in graffiti. There was no sign of the station, the woman, or the man. To this day, I don't know what I experienced that night. Maybe it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or maybe it was something else, something beyond explanation. All I know is that I will never forget that man, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. And every time I drive at night, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere on that dark, lonely road, waiting for the next traveler to stop at the last gas station they'll ever see. Forgotten guest. When Jenny and I found the cabin, it felt like a dream come true. We had been looking for a quiet getaway, a place where we could escape the noise and chaos of city life, where we could unplug and reconnect with each other. The cabin was perfect, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was old, sure, but it had character, with its stone fireplace, wide plank wooden floors, and the cozy warmth that only comes from a place that's been lived in for generations. The realtor had mentioned that the cabin had a bit of a history, but we didn't care. We were just thrilled to have found such a charming place within our budget. Besides, a little history only added to the charm, right? We spent the first few days settling in, exploring the surrounding forest, and enjoying the peace and quiet. The woods were dense and beautiful, with towering pines and oaks that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. At night, the sky was so clear that you could see thousands of stars, a sight that neither of us had experienced in years. It wasn't long before the cabin started to feel like home. But as we would soon discover, we weren't the only ones living there. The first strange thing happened about a week after we moved in. It was a Saturday morning, and Jenny had gone into town to pick up some groceries. I stayed behind to do some work around the cabin. Nothing major, just fixing up a few things here and there. The place was old after all, and it needed some TLC. I was in the kitchen, hammering a loose board back into place, when I heard it. The sound of footsteps upstairs. It was subtle at first, almost like a creak in the floorboards, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Someone, or something, was walking around up there. My first thought was that Jenny had come back early, but when I called out her name, there was no response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one room to the next. I put down the hammer and cautiously made my way to the staircase, calling out again, "Jenny?" Still no answer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I started up the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I checked each room, but there was no one there. The windows were all closed, the doors locked. There was no sign that anyone else had been in the cabin at all. When Jenny returned later that day, I told her what had happened. She laughed it off, saying it was probably just the old house settling, or an animal on the roof. I wanted to believe her, but something about those footsteps had felt too deliberate, too human. A few days later, Jenny found something that made us both question what was really going on. She had been cleaning out one of the closets in the upstairs bedroom when she came across an old leather-bound journal tucked away in the back, covered in dust. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting neat but faded. The journal belonged to a man named Emmett Bedford, who had lived in the cabin decades ago. As we read through the entries, we learned that Emmett had bought the cabin as a retreat after his wife had passed away. He had been looking for solitude, a place to grieve and find peace. But what he found instead was something much darker. The entries started off normal enough. Descriptions of the land, the weather, the work he was doing to fix up the cabin. But as time went on, the tone of the journal shifted. Emmett began to write about strange occurrences, knocks at the door in the middle of the night, cold spots in the house, and the feeling that he was being watched. One entry in particular stood out, November 5th, 1952. The footsteps are back again. Every night they start around midnight, pacing back and forth upstairs. I've checked the attic, the closets, under the bed. There's nothing there, but I know I'm not alone. I can feel it. There's something in this house with me, something that doesn't want me here. I don't know what it is, but I can't leave. Not yet. Not until I figure out what it wants. The entries became more frantic after that, more disjointed. Emmett wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows out of the corner of his eye, and feeling a presence in the house that grew stronger with each passing day. The last entry was dated 2 weeks later, and it was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and erratic. November 19th, 1952. It's here. I saw it last night, standing at the foot of my bed. A man. No, not a man. Something pretending to be one. Hollow eyes, twisted face, skin as pale as death. It whispered to me, told me, my house, leave. But I can't. I won't. This is my home. I won't let it take it. That was the last entry. There were no more pages after that, just blank paper. After reading the journal, Jenny and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the cabin. The strange occurrences became more frequent. The footsteps, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched. We tried to ignore it, to convince ourselves that it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew better. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Words I couldn't quite make out, drifting through the air like a distant breeze. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, but as soon as I moved, the whispering stopped. I glanced over at Jenny, but she was fast asleep, oblivious to the noise. I got out of bed and quietly made my way downstairs, feeling that same heavy sense of dread I had felt before. The cabin was dark and still, the only light coming from the moon shining through the windows. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening, waiting. And then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the night, moving across the far wall. It was fleeting, barely there, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I turned on the lights, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, silent and still. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jenny and I decided we needed to leave. Whatever was in the cabin, it wasn't something we could live with. We packed our bags, loaded up the car, and prepared to go. But as we were about to leave, something stopped us. An overwhelming sense of dread, as if the cabin itself was refusing to let us go. I stood by the door, the key in my hand, when I heard it again, the whispering. This time it was louder, more distinct, like a voice coming from just behind me. I turned, and there it was, the figure from Emmett's journal standing in the doorway to the living room. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pale and drawn, his eyes sunken and dark, and his mouth twisted into a cruel sneer. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, his body thin and gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in years. But the worst part was the way he looked at me, with a mixture of anger and sorrow, as if I had taken something from him. "Leave," he whispered, his voice cold and hollow. "This is my home." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen in place, staring at this thing that had once been a man. It took a step closer, and the temperature in the room dropped, the air growing thick and suffocating. Jenny grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Gavin, we need to go. Now." I nodded, snapping out of my trance. We bolted out the door, leaving everything behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The figure stood in the window, watching us go, his hollow eyes following us until we were out of sight. We never went back to the cabin. We sold it as quickly as we could, taking a loss just to be rid of the place. We didn't tell the new owners about what we had experienced, about the journal or the figure that haunted the house. I didn't have the heart to burden them with that knowledge. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Emmett Bedford and the other souls who might have lived in that cabin before him. How many of them had been driven to madness by the presence in that house? How many had heard the footsteps, the whispering, the cold voice telling them to leave? And I wonder if the new owners are hearing it too. We've moved on, tried to forget about the cabin and the horrors we experienced there. But no matter how far we go, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that the thing in the cabin is still out there, waiting for its next guest, waiting for someone else to stumble into its grasp. And when they do, I fear they won't be as lucky as we were. The Hollow Ones. When Amanda and I moved into the old farmhouse, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. We had spent years in the city, surrounded by noise and chaos, and we were ready for something quieter, something simpler. The farmhouse, with its peeling white paint and creaky floors, was perfect. It was nestled on the edge of a thick forest, miles from the nearest town. The air was fresh, the land sprawling, and the house itself was full of rustic charm. Amanda, always the dreamer, had grand plans for the place. She wanted to turn the barn into a studio where she could paint, and I was excited to start working on the garden. It felt like the kind of place where we could finally slow down, take a breath, and just be. For the first few weeks, that's exactly what we did. We settled in, fixed up the house, and spent our evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the trees. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, a sense of unease began to creep in. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. A chill in the air, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. I tried to ignore it, chalk it up to the quirks of an old house. But it wasn't long before the unease grew into something more tangible, something that couldn't be ignored. It was a cold, windy night when the knocking started. Amanda and I were sitting in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, when we heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping coming from the front door. "Did you hear that?" Amanda asked, looking up from her book. "Yeah," I replied, frowning. "Maybe it's just the wind." But the knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was waiting to be let in. I got up and went to the door, peering out through the small glass window. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard, but there was no one there. Just the dark shapes of the trees swaying in the wind. I opened the door, half expecting to see a stray animal or a branch scraping against the wood, but the porch was empty. The knocking had stopped the moment I turned the handle. "There's no one there," I called back to Amanda. She joined me at the door, her brow furrowed. "That's strange. Maybe it was the house settling." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. There was something unnerving about the sound, something that felt intentional. We went back inside, and for the rest of the night, the knocking didn't return. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The next day, I decided to explore the woods behind the house. I hadn't spent much time back there since we moved in, and something about the previous night's events made me curious. The trees were dense and tall, their branches twisting together to form a thick canopy overhead. The air was damp and cool, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, nothing. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. After walking for about 20 minutes, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old gnarled tree, its trunk twisted and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning. The tree was unlike any I had ever seen. Its bark was rough and cracked, and its branches were bare, devoid of leaves. But what struck me the most was what lay at the base of the tree. A circle of small stones, carefully arranged with strange symbols carved into each one. They were old, weathered by time, but the symbols were still faintly visible, odd shapes and patterns that I didn't recognize. A chill ran down my spine as I approached the circle. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. The air around the tree was colder than the rest of the woods, and as I stood there, staring at the stones, I could have sworn I heard a faint whispering on the wind, indistinct, but full of malice. I didn't stay long. There was a growing sense of dread that pushed me to leave, and I quickly made my way back to the house, my mind racing with questions. Who had made that circle? What did the symbols mean? And why did I feel like I had just stumbled onto something that was better left undisturbed? That night, the knocking returned, louder this time, more insistent. Amanda was the first to hear it, shaking me awake in the middle of the night. "Christian is back," she whispered, her voice trembling. I listened, and sure enough, there it was. The same slow, deliberate knocking coming from the front door. But this time, there was something else. A faint sound beneath the knocking, like a low murmur, almost like voices. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. Amanda followed close behind as I made my way to the front door, every step feeling heavier than the last. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, and the murmuring voices seemed to rise with it, though I still couldn't make out what they were saying. When I reached the door, I took a deep breath and yanked it open, shining the flashlight out onto the porch. Nothing. The porch was empty, just like before. But the knocking hadn't stopped. It was still there, echoing in my ears, even though there was nothing there to make the sound. And then I saw them. 3 dark figures standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. They were tall and thin, their bodies shrouded in shadow, their faces obscured. But I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry. Amanda gasped behind me, and I knew she saw them too. "Close the door," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Close the door, Chris." I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking. The knocking stopped immediately, the voices falling silent. We stood there in the darkness, the only sound our ragged breathing. "What the hell were those things?" Amanda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, still staring at the door. "But I don't think they're gone." Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. The knocking became a nightly occurrence, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the windows. We heard footsteps in the halls, creaking floorboards in the middle of the night, and those same faint, whispering voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But the worst part was the sightings. The dark figures, the hollow ones as Amanda began to call them, started appearing more frequently. We'd see them at the edge of the woods during the day, just standing there, watching. At night, they'd be closer, sometimes right outside the windows, their shadowy forms barely visible in the moonlight. One night, I woke up to find one of them standing at the foot of our bed, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just lay there, paralyzed by fear, until it slowly faded away, melting into the darkness. We tried to leave, but every time we packed up and started the car, it wouldn't start. The engine would sputter and die, no matter how many times we tried. It was as if the house, or whatever was in it, wouldn't let us go. Desperate and terrified, I returned to the clearing in the woods, hoping to find some answers. The circle of stones was still there, as was the old gnarled tree. But this time, there was something new. A tattered, yellowed piece of paper pinned to the tree trunk with a rusty nail. I carefully removed it and unfolded it, revealing a set of instructions written in a shaky, uneven hand. It was a ritual, a way to banish the hollow ones. The instructions were vague and difficult to decipher, but it seemed to involve the circle of stones, a fire, and a blood offering. I knew it was dangerous, but we were out of options. That night, Amanda and I gathered what we needed and returned to the clearing. We built a small fire in the center of the circle, following the instructions as best we could. When the time came, I made the blood offering, a small cut on my palm, letting a few drops fall into the flames. As soon as the blood hit the fire, the air around us grew colder, the wind howling through the trees. The flames flickered and then roared to life, shooting up high into the air. The whispering voices returned, louder this time, almost frantic. And then we saw them, dozens of hollow ones emerging from the darkness of the woods surrounding the clearing. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight as they closed in on us. I finished the ritual, chanting the final words written on the paper. The flames surged one last time, and then, with a deafening roar, they went out, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. The wind stopped, the whispering ceased, and the hollow ones stood motionless around us, their eyes no longer glowing. Amanda clutched my arm, her breath quick and shallow as we waited, terrified of what would happen next. Then, one by one, the hollow ones began to dissolve. Their shadowy forms unraveled like smoke caught in a breeze, dissipating into the night. Within moments they were gone, leaving nothing but the cold air and the lingering scent of burnt wood behind. Amanda and I stood there in stunned silence, unable to fully grasp what had just happened. It was over, or at least it seemed to be. The hollow ones were gone, and the oppressive feeling that had plagued the house had lifted. The ritual had worked. We returned to the farmhouse, shaken but relieved. For the first time in weeks, the house felt normal again. No knocking, no voices, no shadows lurking in the corners. We slept through the night, undisturbed, and when morning came, we both felt like a huge weight had been lifted from our shoulders. Life slowly began to return to normal. The car started without issue, and we even ventured into town a few days later, just to be around people again. Amanda began painting in the barn, and I started working on the garden, finally allowing ourselves to believe that the nightmare was truly over. But there was still a lingering sense of unease. Every time I walked past the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the hollow ones were gone for good, but deep down I wasn't so sure. A week after the ritual, I returned to the clearing, wanting to see if anything had changed. The stones were still there, as was the old tree, but the air felt different, calmer, less hostile. I stood there for a while, staring at the tree, wondering if the ritual had truly banished whatever dark force had been haunting us. Just as I turned to leave, I noticed something etched into the bark of the tree, where the piece of paper had been pinned. It was faint, barely visible, but as I leaned closer, I could make out the words, "We are never truly gone." A chill ran down my spine. I backed away from the tree, my heart pounding. The hollow ones were gone, but the message was clear. They hadn't been destroyed, only banished. And they could come back. Amanda and I never spoke about the hollow ones again. We didn't need to. The farmhouse remained quiet, peaceful even, and we tried our best to move on. But the memory of those shadowy figures, of the whispers and the knocking, never really left us. We decided to sell the farmhouse a few months later. We told ourselves it was because we missed the city, the convenience, the hustle and bustle. But the truth was, we couldn't shake the feeling that the hollow ones were still out there, waiting, watching. As we packed up our things, I found the piece of paper with the ritual instructions tucked away in a drawer. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if I should take it with us, just in case. But in the end, I left it behind, pinned to the same spot on the tree where I had found it. I figured whoever found it next should know what they were dealing with. We moved back to the city, and life eventually settled into a new routine. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear it. A faint, rhythmic knocking, like the echo of a nightmare that refuses to die. I tell myself it's just the house settling or a branch tapping against the window. But deep down, I know better. Because some things never truly go away. They just wait, biding their time until someone new comes along and listens to the whispers in the dark. And when that happens, they'll be ready to return. The house on Birch Hill. When we first moved into the house on Birch Hill, it seemed like a dream come true. My wife Sarah and I had been looking for a place to settle down with our 2 children, Emma and Lily, and the old Victorian-style house fit the bill perfectly. It had charm, history, and space for our growing family. It was everything we had ever wanted, until it wasn't. I'll never forget the day we first walked through the front door. The house had been vacant for years, the previous owners having left under mysterious circumstances. We brushed off the rumours. Small towns always have their stories, and people tend to exaggerate. The price was right, and the house, despite its age, was in excellent condition. We couldn't believe our luck. The first few weeks were blissful. The girls loved their new rooms. Sarah took to the garden, and I was thrilled with my home office. We began to make the house our own, filling it with furniture and memories. It wasn't long before we started to feel truly at home. But looking back, I realized now that the house had been waiting for us to lower our guard, waiting to make itself known. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. It started with small things. A door left open that I was sure I had closed. A light flickering even after I replaced the bulb. But we were busy, preoccupied with settling in, and I paid these incidents little mind. It was only later that I would piece it all together, a jigsaw puzzle of horror that I wish I had never begun. It was a Saturday afternoon when the first undeniable event occurred. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing lunch, and the girls were playing in the living room. I was in my office organising my books when I heard a crash from the hallway. I rushed out to find Sarah standing in the hall, staring at the floor. Several of our family photographs had fallen from the wall, their frames shattered. The strange thing was, only the pictures of the children had fallen. Pictures of Sarah and me, or of us as a family, remained firmly in place. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with unease. "I did," I replied, bending down to pick up the broken frames. "Must have been a breeze or something. Maybe the nails weren't in properly." But as I gathered the photos, I noticed something odd. The nails were still in the wall, firmly embedded, and the picture wire on each frame was intact. There was no logical reason for them to have fallen. "Let's just get some new frames," I suggested, trying to keep my tone light, though a sense of unease had begun to coil in the pit of my stomach. Sarah nodded, but I could tell she was as disturbed as I was. We cleaned up the mess, rehung the photographs, and tried to move on. But the incident stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. A week later, it happened again, this time in the Emma's room. It was late at night, and Sarah and I had just settled into bed when we heard a strange noise coming from the second floor. It was faint at first, but as we listened, it grew louder. Music, soft and tinkling, like a lullaby. Sarah and I exchanged a puzzled glance before getting up to investigate. We followed the sound to Emma's room. To our astonishment, several of her toys were lit up, their melodies playing in eerie, discordant harmony. But there was one problem. These toys had no batteries in them. We had removed them weeks ago when they first started playing by themselves. We thought they were malfunctioning, and rather than replace the batteries, we had simply left them empty. Now, standing in the doorway, watching as the toys played their tune, I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. Something was very wrong. "Turn them off," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I crossed the room and began to pull the toys from the shelves, turning each one over to remove the batteries that weren't there. The music stopped as soon as I touched them, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. We checked on Emma, who were fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the strangeness that had taken place. As we returned to our bedroom, neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. What could we say? There was no rational explanation for what we had witnessed. By this point, I was starting to feel a constant sense of unease in the house, like it was watching us, waiting for something. The events continued to escalate, each one more disturbing than the last. One evening, after putting the girls to bed, Sarah and I were watching television in the living room when we heard a scraping noise upstairs. It was loud, unmistakable, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. "Are the girls still awake?" Sarah asked, her face pale. "I don't think so," I replied, already heading for the stairs. The noise grew louder as I climbed, reverberating through the house. It was coming from Emma's room. I opened the door, half expecting to see one of the girls out of bed. But the room was empty, Emma tucked in, her breathing deep and even. Yet the noise continued, coming from right beneath me. I looked down and saw the floorboards vibrating slightly, as though something massive was moving beneath them. I ran my hand across the floor, feeling the vibrations, but there was nothing there. I called out to Sarah, who joined me, her face tight with worry. "What's causing it?" she asked, her voice strained. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. The noise suddenly stopped, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. We stood there, staring at each other, until Sarah finally broke the silence. "We need to do something," she said. "This isn't normal. We should talk to someone. Maybe a priest, or..." "A priest?" I interrupted, not wanting to admit that the idea had crossed my mind too. "Sarah, let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it's some kind of structural issue with the house. I'll call someone to check it out." But even as I said it, I knew there was no structural issue that could explain what we had experienced. Still, I didn't want to face the alternative. It was Lily, our eldest, who began to experience the worst of it. She was always a bright, cheerful girl, full of life and energy. But after we moved into the house, she began to change. It was subtle at first. She became quieter, more withdrawn. She spent more time alone in her room, claiming she was tired or that she had homework. We chalked it up to adolescence, the natural growing pains of a teenage girl. But then one night, she came to our room, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something in my room." Sarah and I immediately got up and followed her back to her room. She pointed to the corner near her closet where she said she had seen something. A face, pale and twisted, staring at her from the darkness. "There's nothing there, sweetie," I said gently, though I could feel my skin crawling. "It's just your imagination." "No, it's real," Lily insisted, her voice rising. "I saw it, and it was whispering. Horrible things." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. Lily hesitated, her face crumpling in distress. It was saying that it hated me, that I was ugly and worthless. And it laughed at me, Mom. It was laughing. A cold dread settled over me as I listened to my daughter's words. There was something in her tone, something beyond fear. It was a kind of certainty, a knowing that chilled me to the bone. I checked the closet, the windows, and even under the bed, but there was nothing there. We reassured Lily as best we could and stayed with her until she fell asleep, but neither Sarah nor I slept much that night. The next morning, I noticed dark circles under Lily's eyes. She looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept in days. I tried to talk to her about what had happened, but she clammed up, refusing to say more. It was as if she was afraid that talking about it would make it worse. As the days went on, Lily's condition worsened. She began to complain of headaches, nightmares, and a feeling of being watched. Her grades at school dropped, and she started avoiding her friends. She became obsessed with her appearance, spending hours in front of the mirror, picking at imaginary flaws. Sarah and I were beside ourselves with worry. We took her to doctors, therapists, anyone who might be able to help. But no one could explain what was happening to her. They suggested stress, anxiety, maybe even the onset of depression. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something much darker. The final straw came one night when I was sitting in my office, working late. The house was quiet, everyone asleep, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft scratching noise, like nails on wood, coming from the hallway outside my door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Slowly I got up and opened the door, stepping out into the dimly lit hallway. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. I turned, looking down the hall, and that's when I saw it. A face, pale and twisted, peering at me from the shadows at the far end of the hall. It was just like the one Lily had described, but worse. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. I stared, unable to move, as the face seemed to drift closer, the shadows around it pulsing and writhing like something alive. And then it spoke, a raspy, guttural whisper that echoed in my mind. "She's mine." I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was back in my office, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was silent again, but the words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of what I had seen. After that night, I could no longer deny the truth. The house was haunted, and whatever was there wanted my daughter. Sarah and I discussed it, both of us shaken to the core. We decided to bring in a priest, hoping that some kind of blessing or exorcism might rid the house of whatever malevolent force had taken hold. Father Michaels arrived a few days later. He was an older man, with a calm, steady demeanor that put us at ease. But as soon as he stepped into the house, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Concern, maybe even fear. He performed the blessing, walking through each room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. When he reached Lily's room, he paused, his brow furrowing. "There's something here," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Something ancient and very evil." "What can we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Father Michael shook his head. "I can try to cleanse the house, but this is beyond a simple blessing. Whatever is here, it's deeply rooted. I suggest you leave. Get your family out of this house." "But we can't just leave," I protested. This is our home." "Your home is not worth your daughter's life," he said sternly. "Please, for her sake, get out while you still can." Sarah and I looked at each other, the gravity of his words sinking in. But before we could respond, there was a sudden, ear-piercing scream from upstairs. We bolted up the stairs, Father Michael's following close behind. We burst into Lily's room to find her thrashing on the bed, her face contorted in pain, as if something unseen was attacking her. "Get it off! Get it off!" she screamed, clawing at the air around her. Father Michael stepped forward, raising his crucifix. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave this child." There was a deafening roar, a sound like the howling of 1,000 voices, and then silence. Lily collapsed back onto the bed, her body going limp. We rushed to her side, but she was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. "She needs to get to a hospital," Father Michael said urgently. We wasted no time. Sarah and I bundled Lily into the car and rushed to the nearest hospital. She was admitted for observation, and the doctors ran every test they could think of, but they found nothing physically wrong with her. They suggested stress, maybe a psychological breakdown, but we knew better. Lily remained in the hospital for several days, during which time Sarah and I refused to return to the house. We stayed in a hotel, too afraid to go back to that place of nightmares. But we knew we couldn't avoid it forever. We needed to retrieve our belongings, to make arrangements to sell the house and move on. Father Michaels had offered to return with us, to help us gather what we needed and ensure that we weren't alone in that house. Reluctantly, we agreed, and a week after Lily was admitted, we found ourselves standing once again at the front door of Birch Hill. The house felt different as we stepped inside, colder, darker, as though it knew we were leaving. We moved quickly, gathering clothes, important documents, and a few personal items. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the house itself was angry at our decision to leave. As we finished packing, Father Michael suggested we check the basement. Sometimes these entities have a physical anchor, something that ties them to a place. If we can find it, we might be able to weaken its hold. The basement was a dark, damp space that we had barely used since moving in. It was filled with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and an overwhelming sense of unease. As we searched through the clutter, I found a small locked chest hidden in a corner. It was old, covered in dust, and something about it sent a shiver down my spine. "This might be it," Father Michael said quietly. "Do you have the key?" I shook my head. "I've never seen this before." Father Michaels frowned. "We need to open it. Do you have something we can use?" I found a crowbar among the old tools in the basement and pried the chest open. Inside we found a collection of old faded photographs, letters, and a small worn diary. The photos were of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. But as I looked closer, I saw something disturbing. In each photo, the little girl's face was blurred, as though she had been moving when the picture was taken. But there was a malevolent energy to it, as though the blur was hiding something horrific. The diary belonged to the woman in the photos. As I flipped through the brittle pages, I began to piece together a chilling story. The family had lived in the house decades ago, and the little girl had died under mysterious circumstances. The mother had become obsessed with contacting her daughter's spirit, performing rituals and seances in the basement, trying to bring her back. But something had gone wrong. The diary described strange occurrences, much like what we had experienced. objects moving on their own, voices, shadows. The woman wrote of feeling a growing malevolence, as though something had been unleashed that she could not control. The final entry was barely legible, written in a frantic scrawl. "She's still here. She won't leave. She's angry. I can't escape." Father Michaels read over my shoulder, his expression grim. "This is the anchor," he said. "This spirit, this entity, is tied to the house by these objects, by the grief and desperation of this woman. We need to destroy them." We gathered the photographs, the letters, and the diary and took them outside. Father Michael set them on fire, reciting prayers as the flames consumed the old papers. As the fire burned, I felt a strange sensation, a lightening, as though a weight had been lifted from the air around us. When it was over, the house seemed different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a heavy silence. We left that day, never to return. The house was sold to a developer who planned to tear it down, and we moved far away, hoping to leave the horrors of Birch Hill behind. Lily eventually recovered, though she was never quite the same. She refused to talk about what had happened, and we didn't press her. The nightmares continued for a while, but they gradually faded, leaving only the faintest of shadows in their wake. As for Sarah and me, we tried to put the past behind us, but there are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of that house and the entity that resided there haunting my dreams. We never spoke of it again, but sometimes, when I look at Lily, I wonder if it ever truly let her go. The house on Birch Hill may be gone, but some things, I fear, are never truly destroyed. They linger, waiting, watching, biding their time. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of my mind, I can still hear that voice, whispering from the darkness. She's mine. The Last Ride. It's a funny thing, really, how you can drive the same stretch of road 1,000 times and never see a thing out of the ordinary. That's what I kept telling myself the night it happened anyway. I was a trucker by trade, hauling goods across the country, and that highway was as familiar to me as the back of my hand. But that night, something changed. It was around 3 a.m., and I drove one of my usual trips, a long, desolate road that cut through miles of dense forest. There were no streetlights out there, just the occasional reflective sign and the glow of my headlights slicing through the dark. I'd driven this route plenty of times before, usually with the radio on low to keep me company. But that night, there was a storm brewing, and all I could get was static. The rain started as a light drizzle, then quickly escalated into a torrential downpour. My wipers were working overtime, but visibility was still next to nothing. I slowed down, squinting to make out the road ahead, when suddenly I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the wet pavement as I fought to keep control. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there as I came to a screeching halt a few feet away. My heart was pounding as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was a man, dressed in an old tattered coat, soaked to the bone. His hair was matted to his forehead, and his eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight at me. He looked lost, out of place, like he didn't belong there, like he didn't belong anywhere. I rolled down the window a crack, just enough to hear him over the rain. "Hey, are you all right?" I called out, my voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Something about him set off alarm bells in my head. I've seen my fair share of weirdos on the road, but this was different. This guy... There was something off about him. But it was pouring rain, and I couldn't just leave him there. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, against my better judgment. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, he nodded. I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in without a word. The interior light flickered as he did, casting long, twisted shadows across the dashboard. He didn't say a thing, just stared straight ahead as I put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the road. The rain pounded against the roof of the cab, a constant deafening roar. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was headed, but he didn't answer. He just sat there, hands clasped tightly in his lap, water pooling at his feet. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, and I was starting to regret picking him up. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Up ahead," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "There's a turnoff. Take it." His voice sent a shiver down my spine, low and monotone, almost mechanical. I didn't want to take that turnoff, didn't want to leave the main road, but something in his tone told me I didn't have a choice. We drove in silence for a few more miles before I saw it. A narrow, overgrown dirt road veering off to the right. It wasn't marked on any map, and I'd never noticed it before, but there it was, plain as day. "Take it," the man repeated, and against every instinct screaming at me to keep driving, I did. The truck jostled as we left the pavement and started down the dirt road. The trees closed in around us, their branches clawing at the sides of the cab. The rain had turned the road into a muddy mess, and I had to keep a tight grip on the wheel to keep from sliding off into the trees. The further we went, the worse the feeling in my gut got. It was like the air was getting thicker, harder to breathe, and the darkness outside the truck was pressing in, swallowing the headlights. The man was still staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "Where are we going?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just kept staring, his eyes locked on something in the distance that I couldn't see. Finally, after what felt like hours, the road ended. There was nothing ahead of us but a wall of trees, and I realized with a start that the rain had stopped. Everything was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine. The man opened the door and stepped out, his boots sinking into the mud. He didn't look back as he walked toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows without a word. I sat there, heart hammering in my chest, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted to follow him, to see where he was going. But the rest of me, the smarter part, knew that would be a mistake. I put the truck in reverse, my hands shaking as I backed out of the clearing and back onto the dirt road. I didn't look back, not once, as I sped down that road and back onto the highway. I didn't care that I was breaking every speed limit. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. When I finally made it to the next town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself it was just some weird drifter, that there was nothing supernatural about it, but deep down, I knew better. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked around about the dirt road. Most people just gave me blank looks, saying they didn't know of any road like that. But one old-timer, a grizzled man with a thick beard, just shook his head and said, "You're lucky you got out of there. That road, it don't lead anywhere good." I never took that route again at night. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I think about that man in the coat. those empty eyes, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned around, if I'd followed him into the trees. And then I remind myself that some questions are better left unanswered. Thanks for listening. Don't ghost the like button, press it, and bloody subscribe. Love you and sleep tight.